Okay, I'm going to start now, and I'm going to do this in English because there are more people coming, and I want everyone to understand, and it's going to be streamed online. So this is going to be in English, but feel free to ask, if you have questions or comments, you are more than welcome to ask in Swedish or Finnish, but I will speak English while I'm up here. Anyway, welcome everybody. I am so very happy to see you all here to celebrate the release of my paperback. The hardback came out about a year ago, but I didn't want to celebrate it then because when academic publishers publish books, they first give out a really expensive hardback copy. And since there's so many people who are interested in what I write about, I wanted to wait until the more affordable paperback came out before I organized an event. And I'm so happy to see you all today because today has been a really strange day. First, our plans were changed a little bit. Larry, who was supposed to be here to interview me, he unfortunately got sick and couldn't be here. And I said, no problem. I will give a talk instead of doing an interview. So I had to sort of, start thinking about that all of a sudden. And people have been sending me messages all day saying that they can't come after all. It turns out that a lot of people are sick. And I think maybe that's something we've learned during COVID, to actually not come if you're sick. So that's a good thing, right? But so I am so pleased that you are here. So please have some wine, chocolates, and sit back and relax, and I hope we'll have a good time together. So, as you know, I've been researching something that's called opting out for several years now. It's something that feels very important to me to research. I think that there's something about working life that isn't really working today, and the whole phenomenon of people opting out of careers or opting out of a certain way of working tells us something about what doesn't work in organizations, but also gives us a clue for what we maybe should be doing differently. So it feels like very important work. But not everybody is talking about or using the term opting out anymore. Now we hear terms like the Great Resignation, which you probably recognize. Hi, come in, welcome, have wine, sit down, enjoy yourselves. The Great Resignation, the quit, the attrition, there are a lot of different terms that people have started throwing around and that we've started seeing in the media to describe what's happening in organizations today. And let me tell you, it's all the same thing. It's all opting out. It's just maybe become a little bit more extreme because of COVID. I think the situation, it became more clear to people that they weren't happy with the way they were working. It's been hard for people, and people have started voicing the fact that they aren't happy, and more people have started quitting. And so now we've also started measuring it, which we never did before, and looking at how many people are actually quitting and how many people want to quit. But it's all the same thing. It's all the same reasons as what I have been researching in my research on opting out. I need to put my glasses on to see my notes. So there are different studies on how many people who dream of doing something else. And it varies depending on the study, but today, in some studies have shown that up to 70% of people dream of quitting or of changing their jobs. But even before COVID, there was a few years ago, there was a study which it was of all employees globally. And of all employees globally, 50% were reported to be unhappy in their work. And also in the organizational sphere, apparently middle managers are among the most unhappy, this is a very interesting thing to think about. But it means that there's something wrong with work. It means there's something wrong with how we view work and how we expect work to happen. And it's quite interesting because during COVID, a lot has happened, and we've realized that we can change things that we didn't think we could change, working from home, for example. There are many areas where we thought that was simply impossible, but then we had to do it, so it was possible. So organizations have become very much more open to that. But still, I find that organizations are slow to change their cultures and change their way of thinking. And there are a lot of people who just, aren't happy in their jobs or aren't doing well, and mental health issues have skyrocketed during the past few years. And one of the main reasons is stress and insecurity at work and constant restructuring in the organizational sphere or in the work sphere. So, having said that, this is just to show that how important this is as a topic. I mean, if up to 70% of people are dreaming about doing something else, that isn't very sustainable. But it's kind of interesting because, I've been researching this topic. People have been very interested in it, and also as I've researched it during the years, I've also noticed that a lot of people are interested in opting out. So when I talk to people about what it is I do, many people get a sort of dreamy look and sort of say, oh, I wish I could do that too. But most people don't, because it's actually it's very difficult to do. To just opt out of a job unless there's something that pushes you is very hard to do, because you're jumping into the unknown, and you know what you know, but you don't know what you don't know. But this opting out research, it gives us a clue about what it is that people need and what it is that people want in their work. So a few years ago, when I finished my PhD, and my research got quite a lot of media attention. There were a lot of life coaches that contacted me, and they thought, well, this is great. Here we have an expert on opting out, and they wanted to collaborate with me to ask if maybe we could work together to help people opt out. But I was flattered, of course, but I said, thank you, but no thank you. I'm not an opting out coach. I opted out myself. I used to have a corporate career, and now I'm a researcher, a writer, and an artist. So I've opted out more than once. But I don't believe that this is the answer to have everybody opting out. We need to create workplaces that people won't want to leave. So this is my thinking behind opting out. So my own journey with opting out started, or with the topic, so to speak, started when I started working on my PhD. I started by researching women. I didn't originally want to start with women, but the debate had been about women, and I needed to participate in that debate, and I needed to be able to write a PhD that wasn't so broad that I would actually finish it. So I decided to start with women, and that research resulted in this book. I just brought it to show to you. But I knew then, when I started out, that this isn't just a women's phenomenon. This is a phenomenon, this is about all of us. Opting out is something that anybody can do, and anybody does. And I've researched careers, but you can opt out of anything. I mean, opting out simply means that you want to stop doing things in a certain way, or in a certain way that's expected, to do things on your own terms, to do things in a way that works for you. And in the case of my research, where I've researched the work setting, to do things in a way that's sustainable. So I knew then that I was going to continue with men after this, or after I finished researching women, which I have, and now it has resulted in a book, which I'm very pleased to say. And I'm not done yet, of course, because I need to continue, because it's not only about women and men, it's also about organizations. So my next step is, of course, going to be about organizations. But my first book, even though it was about women, it also has a sort of broader societal aspect, where I look at opting out also out of a sort of societal point of view. And this new book is actually a natural, sort of a continuation of that, whereas I look at men and I've researched men, but it's also about work and more about the sort of organizational level, about how we work, how we're expected to work, and why that doesn't work. And also about what it means to be a man in society. So they go well together as well, but also on their own, obviously. So next I thought I would tell you, and also you can interrupt me anytime if you have questions, by the way. I like to be interrupted. So if there's anything you want to ask, please do. So what I'm going to talk about, I'm going to tell you a little bit about this book and tell you a little bit about what the difference between men and women is, or what the similarities are and what the differences are. And then I'm actually going to read to you a story from this book. This book is full of stories of men who have opted out. I interviewed a lot more men than are in this book. Unfortunately, I couldn't include everyone, but I chose 15 stories that illustrate the different aspects that I raise in this book very well. And I'm going to read one of those stories to you. The interesting thing between the men and the women opting out is, or let me just say first that it was interesting when I started telling people that after I had researched women opting out, which everybody got, and they were like, oh yeah, that's a really, really interesting topic. But when I said, now I'm going to start on a new research project and I'm going to research men opting out, the reactions were really quite interesting. So a lot of people said, well, good luck. Good luck interviewing men, because men don't opt out. You're not going to find many men to interview. And if you do, good luck interviewing them, because men don't talk about their feelings. You know, I had done a study of identity in my first research project, and it was what I was planning to do for my second research project. And I can tell you that none of that was true. Men do opt out. And just to illustrate, I can tell you that when I looked for women to interview in my first research project, it was really easy to find women. You know, it became sort of a snowball thing where and the people would start contacting me saying, you can interview me, because when people have opted out and into something new, they're generally a lot happier about the new thing they're doing, because they've done a lot of soul searching, and so typically they want to talk about it. And maybe they haven't talked about it so much with people close to them, because people don't generally, sometimes it's hard for other people to understand, to be able to relate to something you've gone through. So it was very easy to find these women. But for my project, when I started interviewing men, I thought I should probably interview more men than women, because people think that men don't opt out. And actually, as far to my knowledge, nobody has researched men opting out or written about men opting out before me. This is actually a first. So I thought I should probably research more men. And it was, again, it wasn't hard to find men to research. And I had a relatively long list. And I had decided how many I was going to interview, as twice as many as the women. But people kept contacting me, so I got more and more names all the time, and people who, I mean, I wasn't even interviewing anymore, so, you know, I had to tell people that, thank you, that sounds really interesting, I would love to talk to you, but I'm not interviewing anymore. And still sometimes a man will contact me saying, I have opted out, do you want to interview me? And I published my book a year ago. So, just to illustrate, the list of men I have is a lot longer than the list of women I ever had on opting out. So yes, men do opt out, and yes, they talk about their feelings. So the interviews have been amazing, and the material I got for this book was absolutely amazing. And I'm, of course, really very grateful to everybody who wanted to share their story with me, because without the stories, it wouldn't have been the research, and I wouldn't have been able to publish the book. But so what's the difference then between men and women? Well, I don't know if I was expecting there to be a difference, but when I started doing the interviews and I did more and more of these interviews, I realized that actually I didn't really see much of a difference. So for the women, when I interviewed the women, one thing that was really remarkable was that all the stories, I mean, I interviewed in the US and I interviewed here for the women, and for the men I also interviewed in the UK, so for the men it was 3 countries. But for the women, all the stories were so similar. They were basically exactly the same. Of course, there were details that were different. There were new, they had opted into different things, opted out of different work and opted into new things, and there were details and certain things that were different for the different people. Welcome, come in. But their process was really quite the same. So they would go through a process where they actually didn't plan to opt out, but they were often very tired. Often they felt like they didn't really have control over their lives and of their work, and they lacked a sense of coherence. We need to have a sense of coherence. We need to know who we are, why we do what we do, why why we work where we work. It's called having a coherent life narrative, and we need to be able to create one for our well-being. And the people who opted out before opting out, they had difficulties finding a sense of coherence. But they didn't plan to opt out. But something happened that pushed them to take the step and to actually make this change. And they often had a crisis of some sort. It was something that gave them a sort of a light bulb moment that made them see that I have to make a change in my life. And then it was a difficult process, and they had to do a lot of soul searching, and they had spent a lot of time thinking about who they are and what was important to them and what they were willing to give up and what they weren't willing to give up for work, for example. And then they opted into something new, which gave them where they had more control over how they worked and when they worked and where they worked sometimes too. And this control then gave them a sense of coherence and a sense of authenticity. So I saw this process through all the narratives, actually, of the women. And then when I started interviewing the men, I tried to, you go in and you try to be open-minded and you try to think that, this might be different. And first I thought it was. First I thought that this doesn't seem to be like the women. But the more I listened, when you go as a researcher, and you're of course a little bit nervous because you want the interview to go well, and so I tape the interviews in order to be able to go back, because when you're a little bit nervous, you don't always catch everything. But when I started listening carefully, I realized that actually these men are talking about the same thing, maybe with different words, but they're talking about the same thing. So actually, the men's process was really also very similar. All the men in all the different countries I interviewed, there was a time of confusion or a lack of control or being very fatigued. There was something that gave them a light bulb moment where they realized, I can't do this anymore, I have to change something. And then they changed their way of working and their way of being, I guess, and then, and opted into something where they found, a much more sustainable way of working and living, for them sustainable. And but they talked about, of course, they talked about the same types of things. They talked about relationships and people in their lives that are important, and they talked about dreams, and they talked about what they want to do, and it was all very similar. But still, the narratives were quite different in one way, and the way they were different was the expectations that are placed on men in society compared to the expectations we place on women. So the differences were actually only the sort of social construction of how we understand what is a good man versus what is a good woman. So it's quite interesting because for men, what I found was, or actually research has also shown this, other research has also shown this, that the breadwinner model is really, really very important. So even in a country like Finland, where there is a tradition of both men and women working, and in Finland, women work, the amount of women working full-time in Finland is among the highest in the EU and in the world. Still, there is a really strong narrative about men having to be the breadwinners and having to support the family. And there is a really strong sort of idea in society about what a good man is. I mean, you all have heard this. Real men don't cry, or real men don't show weakness. It's a really, really, really strong narrative. And it's interesting because for women, because of the feminist movement, we tell girls a lot, or all the time, that you can be anything you want to be. It's very important because girls haven't had options like men have had. So we tell them, you can be anything you want to be. You should be anything you want to be. This isn't, of course, completely true. There are still cases where, for example, especially girls with different ethnic backgrounds are often told that you need to be nurses, which is terrible. But in general, we tell girls, you can and should be anything you want to be. But we don't tell boys that. We tell boys that you have to be strong and you have to have a good job, And so one thing I saw was that when these men that I interviewed, when they chose what to study at university, for example, when they chose their profession, they were much more affected by their environment. They chose things that were prestigious, that promised a high salary, that promised, power, and they were also very much affected by what their parents thought they should be. Everyone in my family has been a lawyer, so I had to be a lawyer. Or all my friends decided to become engineers, so I needed to become engineers. So I saw that among the men, which I didn't see among the women. The women chose their professions because that's what they really wanted to do. And so this was, of course, also visible in these men's narratives. So there were a lot of men, there's also that difference. For women, it's, a lot of women opted out because if they had children, for example, it was just simply too much to be both the mother and to do everything, and they were very tired. But for men, there was more of a sort of realization, not all of them, obviously, but for many of them, there was more of a realization that this just isn't me. This isn't me. So I've interviewed a lot of investment bankers and a lot of management consultants. I have interviewed some lawyers and from, many sort of very high-paying, very high-stress areas, and they just realize, this isn't me. I just can't do this, which is interesting. So that was a difference. I have to check my notes. Hold on. And then another thing that another thing that I saw among the men was a disillusionment at work. So for women, for them it was, women often think that it's their own fault. If something doesn't go well, they think, well, it's probably just me. And also women don't like to share if they think it's very hard at work, or if they don't like to tell other people, because as we all know, women have to work really hard to get to where they are. They can't show any weakness because they're women. So they don't generally share with each other if it's too hard or if they're tired. So they feel very alone. So they feel like this must just be my own problem. But for the men, often they were very disillusioned by the organization, and they just felt that the organization where they worked was unethical. Some of them felt that there was unethical treatment of other employees. Some of them felt that there was unethical treatment of clients. There was one man I interviewed, he had seen how his wife had been treated at another job, at another company, and was so put off by the whole by the whole area, basically. And so there was a lot of disillusionment about, organizations. I can't do this. I can't stand for this, and I can't represent it, and I have to leave. But the interesting thing is, and this is contrary to popular belief, we believe that men are, of course, the ones with the power in society. We talk about this a lot. And so men are also the ones with the power in organization. And this is, of course, true. Men are often in the power positions in organizations. But what my research has also illustrated is that if a man wants to do something differently in an organization, if he doesn't feel comfortable with the way things are done, it's really hard also for a man to change that culture, and it's easier to leave. Because these men, they wanted to change things in the organizations, but they ended up leaving. And some of them, one of them was told that, well, if you can't handle that, maybe you should be working somewhere else. So we have a difficult situation here where it's actually hard to change these corporate cultures that are so very strong. But it's not impossible, and I plan to do it. Yes? Yes?
In the beginning, you stated that actually the most stressful position, according to some of the scientific research, is those of middle managers.
Yes.
Why is that? And second, considering that most pressure is put on the shoulders of men to follow certain patterns, being family pressure, society expectations, so on, starting from university and so on, while it's not the case for women, shouldn't be the case that actually women end up in position where they are more satisfied?
More satisfied. Okay. So I'm just going to repeat your question quickly for the camera and for everybody who's online. So the first was why is it middle managers that are the most unhappy? And the other one was, well, if women are choose what they want to do, shouldn't they be more happy in their positions? Now, unfortunately, both these questions crave really long answers, so they're going to be really hard for me to answer very quickly, and I think we should have a very long discussion after this. Well, middle managers is very interesting because they often are the ones who have to execute decisions, but they don't always make the decisions. I think this is maybe one reason. This is a very quick analysis. And another one is that middle managers often get a lot of extra work. Sometimes the promotion isn't actually moving up, it's getting more below you. So I think middle managers work very hard. That's the quick answer. And for the women, well, you should read my book, my first book. It's also a long answer. The reason they weren't unhappy, most of them were actually not unhappy with what they were doing. They actually liked their jobs. They had chosen, just as you said, they had chosen what they wanted to do based on what they wanted to do, So it wasn't so much about them not being happy, it was also circumstances. And there are a lot of, it was a good idea actually to start with women and to separate them like this because the expectations we place on men and women in society are very different. So it's very specific for women and men. And for women, women still get discriminated in the organizational world. They feel very alone. They have, they take the brunt of the household chores and childcare. They do most of that work. They're often responsible for that, where their husbands or spouses maybe help. There are a lot of different issues that are particular to women. So among the women, I saw a lot of exhaustion for that reason. But also there were feelings that they didn't feel like they could be themselves. If they had children, for example, they didn't feel they could share that at work because it's not okay to talk about children at work. For men, it is. For men, it's a good thing to have children because it makes you a good manager. For women, it's a bad thing because then your priorities might not be completely what they should be, So we have different sort of ideas we view men and women differently, even though we shouldn't. So that's the quick answer. Where was I? So I'm almost done. So we're not going to sit here all evening. Soon we'll have wine and be able to talk. Disillusioned. Right. There was one more thing I wanted to say about men, about that it is, it's harder for men to opt out than it is for women. Because in society, nobody really expects a woman to have a career, which is sad, because women are basically expected to be mothers, even though we don't say that outright, but there's a very sort of intimate connection between you're a good woman if you're a good mother. And so if a woman says, and women I found, or other researchers also supported this, when women opt out of careers, they will often say, I need to spend more time with my children, even though the children aren't actually the reason. And nobody will argue with that. They will actually applaud women who say that, because then they're good mothers. And for men, it's harder because men are expected to have the career, as I said, to be the breadwinners. And this is, this is wrong, of course, because men and women both want careers. Men and women both want to have families. It isn't so that women want to have families and men want to have careers. Men and women want all these things and want to have meaningful work. So it's wrong, but this is how society views it. Yeah. So for men, when men opt out, it's much harder because it's actually a little bit shocking that a man would maybe choose not to work or choose a job with a lower salary because we expect men to pursue these careers. And it has been really interesting in the narratives I've collected, where there was one man, for example, who he talked a lot about how it's very problematic. He might need to start working again, more because he needs to have a higher salary. And then I asked him what his wife does, because I knew that he was married, and apparently she was also a really high earner. So they weren't dependent on his salary, but it was really difficult for him to sort of let go of that notion that he needed to be the one to bring the money to the family. And there are other stories too. I mean, I interviewed men who didn't have families, and still they were already thinking about that they need to have jobs to support potential future families, even though, they weren't even planning it. So it's harder for men to opt out than it is for women. And there's just one small detail, one small little thing I want to add before I read the story of Matti. It was interesting in the US when I interviewed, when I looked for men to interview there. I have a contact person in the US who has helped me set up interviews. And when I went there to interview women, it was really easy for her to find women for me to interview. And when I went to interview men, as the date was approaching for when I was supposed to go there and conduct the interview, I was wondering why I hadn't heard from her. And then she emailed me and she said, "You know what, I'm having real problems finding men for you to interview." And she said, "But it isn't that I haven't found men who have opted out, because there are a lot of men who have opted out, but they don't want to be interviewed." And I didn't see any of that here in Finland or in the UK. And the US, I don't know how many of you are familiar with the culture in the US, but it's much more of a macho society. And I did finally find a whole bunch of men to interview in the US, but they were all men who had opted out to become stay-at-home dads. So the men who opted out to do something else, to stop working or to work differently, they didn't want to be interviewed, but becoming a stay-at-home dad was a good enough excuse. It wasn't perhaps, so the men who didn't want to become stay-at-home dads, they just didn't want to be interviewed. So I have a whole chapter here also on American stay-at-home dads. Anyway, this is getting long, so I'll read to you the story of Matti, and then we can round this up and have wine, okay? So this is Matti. He is Finnish. Breaking free from expectations. Matti was 34 years old at the time of the interview, which was younger than most of my other interviewees. A few years earlier, he had opted out of a career in consulting to focus on his photography. He no longer wanted to work in a corporate environment, but rather wanted to pursue a different lifestyle and realize a dream he had had since he was a little boy. When I met him, he had recently started working in the corporate world again, although this time not as a consultant. Making ends meet as a photographer, which was what he had been dreaming about, was difficult, and he simply needed to work to be able to support himself. It was quite clear from the start that he had a well-versed story that he told people about his opting out and in journey. This is not unusual. Most, if not all, the individuals I've interviewed have created stories, both for themselves, but also for others to make sense of their choices and experiences. Creating stories for ourselves is part and parcel of creating a coherent life narrative, which we need to do for our well-being. When we do it for others, it's mostly to stave off the questions that follow what might seem like a surprising decision or life choice. On the surface, Matti's opting out process seemed very straightforward. He had worked long hours as a consultant and had already decided, while he was at university, that he would try to pursue his photography professionally at some point. After a couple of years of working around the clock, he decided the time was right to finally pursue his own dream. Instead of quitting his job, he took a leave of absence, knowing it would be hard to live off his photography. He explained that he had already considered that he might come back to working in the business world if he did not manage to get his photography business off the ground. It all sounded sensible and well planned. However, as the interview progressed and he started talking in more detail about what exactly happened, it was clear that both the situation and his reasons for leaving were more complex than just pursuing his dream. Matti got into consulting early. He had a part-time job at a consulting firm while he was at university and was recruited for a full-time job before he graduated. He worked on his thesis on weekends and managed to get his degree after about 3 months. The pace was high, and he worked 16-hour days, leaving little energy for anything else. He had hoped that he would be able to pursue his passion, photography, when his weekends got freed up again after finishing his thesis, but there was no time nor energy left for anything other than work. Still, working was fun at first. It was prestigious, and he learned a lot, he explains. In the beginning, it was actually a lot of fun. When things go well for the company and you have a lot of projects, it's mostly also fun, even though you work long days. You're sort of like a rock star. It is really quite crazy, and especially considering you don't really get compensated for the work you do in the evenings, it feels so crazy. But then again, I have learned incredibly much, and it is a school I could recommend to anyone who graduates from business school and doesn't know exactly what they want to do. So 2 years in consulting, and you at least know what you don't want to do. At first, he didn't really stop to question the pace or the methods of working. It was not until later he realized how extreme the working hours really were. What we did at the company was completely crazy. We get better work done now at the company where he had started working since, after opting into the new thing, that is, than we did there. I think the culture is the same in all consultancy companies. You look up to people who work a lot, you look up to those who work the most hours, and you work all night so that you are the king of the office, and it's like, wow. I have, for example, worked 28 hours in one go, and it's like, wow, that's so cool. And then afterwards, you're like, I'm an idiot. As he talks, he repeatedly uses the word crazy to describe the pace and working culture, and it gives me a feeling that there may be more to his reasons for leaving than simply a desire to pursue his dream. It was not unusual for my male interviewees to not share information spontaneously about a crisis or a difficult situation that may have pushed them to leave. In addition, I knew from experience that few people make life-altering decisions on just a whim, especially ones that are financially very insecure. Leaving a job for the unknown is a very big step, one that most do not do without some sort of incident or experience that works as a catalyst for change. About half an hour into the interview, I finally asked if there was anything in particular that happened that made him decide to take the leave of absence and pursue his hobby. Without any hesitation whatsoever, he said yes. There had indeed been an incident at work that had made him question whether or not he wanted to work for his employer anymore. Although this incident was not part of the narrative he clearly had built around his experiences, his quick response suggested that it was still top of mind for him. He had been working in a team on a project for an important client. The project was going well, and the client was happy with their work. At one point, a mistake was discovered, a miscalculation in an analysis. Although getting the numbers right was important, Matti insists that it actually did not change anything, and the client was still happy with their work. However, internally, this mistake was the cause of a crisis or a panic, as Matti puts it. Several meetings were held where it was feared that the whole business was at stake. Matti contends that his colleagues and his boss overreacted, as the client was never unhappy with their work. In the end, Matti was the one who got the blame for the mistake, despite not having been involved in making it. He does not speculate as to why he was blamed, but he felt unfairly treated and wrongly accused, he explains. Consultants have exactly as much credibility as their numbers. If they are right, everything is okay, but if they're wrong, there is a huge panic. So there was actually an incident which didn't actually have anything to do with me, but I got the crap for it. I noticed that this must be difficult for him to talk about. He's hesitant and his words do not flow like they did when he was telling me his practiced or prepared narrative. He is also quite vague about the details of what exactly happened. What is clear, however, is how upset he still is by this incident. It had happened just before he was due to take his annual leave. He felt quite disillusioned. He was frustrated and angry because it had not been his fault, and he was exhausted both physically and mentally. He spent his leave resting and catching up on sleep. With the time and space to reflect over the situation and over his life, he started to realize that he just did not want to go back. It was then he decided to apply for a leave of absence. Although he had, at the beginning of the interview, explained that he just wanted to do it to make time for his photography, at this point in the interview, photography started to sound more like a lifeline and a ticket to something else. He comments, I knew that even though it was just going to be a leave of absence, I wasn't going to go back, that's for sure. I was like, never again. When he got back to work after his vacation, Matti applied for a year's leave of absence. Having been a high earner, he had savings, but he also sold his apartment in order to be able to get his photography business on its feet. He moved in with his girlfriend, and although he had somewhere to live and a plan B consisting of an agreement to go back to work in a year's time, it still felt really scary. This is one of the reasons most people don't opt out despite dreaming about it. Jumping into the unknown is scary, and it is not something that individuals generally do unless the alternative, to stay, is even worse. Many of Matti's friends told him how brave he was, which he explains irritated him a bit because he certainly didn't feel brave. He was just doing what he had to do. In fact, this is something that many of my interviewees have experienced, people telling them how brave they are to make the changes that so many seem to just dream of doing. However, they don't see themselves as brave, as most of them have not felt that staying was an alternative. For his parents, Matti's decision to leave a secure job to pursue his hobby was harder to accept. He talks about how his father called him a few times after he left the consulting company, and that he knew that his mother had put him up to it. He feels the pressure of living up to expectations and talks about how he is sure that a lot of people think he burnt out or had a breakdown or something, and that photography was just a cover. He adds that especially his colleagues were probably skeptical. It becomes clear that Matti still struggles to consolidate the social expectation of having a career and pursuing it in a certain way with his own wants and needs. He contradicts himself as he first talks about how it has been important for him that others understand that it was not a question of burnout, but then adds that he doesn't really care what other people think. Then he contradicts himself again and says that hopefully one day people who doubt him will understand. It is contradictions like these that provide a glimpse of the unsaid. In this case, it suggests that he really does care. He comments, in a way, I still wanted everyone to know that this is what I want to do and still have that feeling. I don't care very much about what other people think, but I hope at some point that they will understand. Matti talks about his experiences like they are no big deal, while also repeatedly using words like breakdown, burnout, exhaustion, and anger. He also laughs a lot when he talks, which gives me a feeling that he's still struggling to come to terms with his experiences. When Matti's year was up, he handed in his letter of resignation. He never had the intention of going back, and he wanted to break all ties with the firm. However, about half a year later, he started running out of money and realized he was not going to be able to support himself as a photographer. Just as he was coming to terms with the fact that he was going to have to find another job, his former boss, who had also left the consulting firm, called him and offered him a job, which he accepted right away. The job was a managerial position in an industrial company, and the hours were much more humane and the corporate culture quite different, he comments. To start working for the company actually felt a lot better than I thought it would. It is a really good compromise because I work so little compared to when I worked as a consultant that I have time to pursue my photography in my free time. I'm not tired, and I have time to exercise. I have time for everything. It's like perfect work-life balance now. I've noticed that I'm a more stable person now. I am more focused. I am more energetic. I am more everything when I can, how do I put this, develop my creative self. Matti left his job in consulting disillusioned over having been wrongly treated and blamed for something he didn't do. However, he was also exhausted. The hours that he was expected to work at the consultancy firm were crazy, and working did not leave room for anything else in his life, including exercise or even adequate sleep. He did not manage to make his photography business profitable, and although he comments that he would much rather continue pursuing his photography if he could, his new job in the industrial company provides him with a better and more balanced life. Anyway, I'll stop there. That was the story of Matti. So, I'm done. Do you have any questions? Or shall we just move on to the mingling? I think we'll move on. Oh, no, we do have a question. Yes, I did actually, because the whole opting out debate originated in the United States, and it's been only about women, and it's been only about women who leave work to become stay-at-home moms, or leave their careers to become stay-at-home moms. And the funny thing is, though, that there is absolutely no research or no statistics to support that women actually leave careers to become stay-at-home mothers. On the contrary, women with careers don't generally do that. They leave to do something else. So I was convinced that it wasn't about, well, I didn't think it was about women specifically, and I didn't think it was about children specifically. So I started interviewing women without children also. But then, when it's a PhD, you realize that the broader you go, the more problematic, so you have to go narrow. So I decided to focus only on women with children. But I can tell you that also the women without children, their narratives were also identical, or the same. They went through the same process too as the women with children. So, it isn't only about children. And also, we don't only care for children in society. We have other people we care for too, So our care responsibilities aren't only about children. It's also about maybe siblings, maybe parents, maybe friends, So there were similar issues with or without children. And the same with the men. Yeah. Yep. Do it.
Even I feel in most of my friends, like we always say this, that yes, we don't care about what the society thinks, but when we change, we often give the contradictory answer. And I
Yes.
feel right now that yeah, you're doing that.
Right. So I just forgot, I need to repeat the question. So you said that it's quite interesting how you and your friends feel like you also always talk about how you don't care what society thinks, but then you actually do.
Maybe the society will know what we are doing.
Yeah, I know, it's funny, but
So why is it like that? I don't even know.
it, yeah. I think it's complicated, obviously, but but it's also what we tell ourselves, We don't really want to care what society thinks. But I mean, I've opted out too, and it's quite interesting. I mean, I obviously don't care what society thinks, right? Because none of us do. But you get a lot of reactions from people in your surroundings. When I opted out, most of the reactions were positive. People were like, "Wow, you're so brave." I heard that too. I've heard a lot of people say, "You're so brave," and I wish I could do that too. I didn't feel brave at all. I felt like there was no alternative, and the thought of actually staying was more scary. It's a long story, but anyway. So we tell ourselves what we need to hear, but it's hard, of course. I mean, and we get that ever since we're small children. We're told, how we should be, and then a lot of people don't understand. So when you make a big change, for a lot of people also, different people know different parts of you, but you're actually a very complex being. There are many different parts of you, but in certain circles, they'll see a certain part of you, and at work, they'll see a certain part of you. And then when you make a decision like that, it can be very shocking for people. And it's funny because often people, often feel threatened by things that other people do in their own life that don't even affect them, because it sort of disrupts their image of the world. So we get a lot of reactions from other people, and we're told, of course, to care a lot about what other people think. Sorry, so we're hypocrites? We are or we aren't hypocrites? We are? I don't know. We can take a vote. You had a question. The age range. So the women... Well, that's a very good question. So the age range, the women I interviewed were generally between, say, 35 and 45, and then there were maybe some that were one or two a little bit younger, and maybe one that was a little bit older, and the men were often a little bit older, so they were maybe between 45 and 55, and then again, some were a little bit younger, like Matti was a little bit younger, and then there was one who was a little bit older. And I get this question a lot, like, can young people opt out, or do old people opt out? I think that this is something that, for the women, many of them were in the situation where it was really very, very intense. They had come to a certain point in their career, and many of them had families, and it was very intense. And I also think that when you come to a certain position, so like for one of the men I interviewed, when he made partner in his firm, it was really hard for him because he was very introverted. He described himself as an introvert, and it was really difficult for him to be in a partner position because all of a sudden he had to start selling and, getting clients, and he felt very uncomfortable with that. So it became so clear how uncomfortable he was at that point in his career. But I mean, I've been involved in a research project where I was involved in writing an article based on data that was on women who were all in their 60s and had opted out because they just couldn't take working in these organizations anymore, where they couldn't get credit for the work they were doing, or they were always the wrong age. Women are, by the way, always the wrong age. You're either too young, or you're at a childbearing age, or you're too old. So it's always wrong. And so they opted out and started their own companies in their 60s. And then people often come up to me to tell me their opting out stories, which is actually, I love it. I love hearing stories. I love telling stories too. So I love it when they do that. And a lot of people will share their opting out stories with me. And I mean, I've had people come in their early or mid-20s, and they've like opted out of the career before they even started it. So I think it's something that actually, I don't think it's bound to any certain age. Yeah. Well, the crises, they were very varied. I can't tell you that there is one that would be the most common. Well, exhaustion is very common. I didn't want to, I actually decided early on that I didn't want to interview people who have burnt out. Not because they aren't relevant. There are a lot of people who burn out, and it's actually really very problematic. But for my study, I wanted to find out, why is it that people in successful positions, like who have it all, why do they choose to leave if they don't have to, if they could continue? So I wanted, if you burn out, it's hard to continue. So I wanted to interview people who hadn't burnt out. But to tell you the truth, they were all really, really exhausted. So they might actually count as burnout. So that was very, very common. But for the crisis that finally, gave them the light bulb moment, it was like anything from, maybe someone got sick, or somebody in their family got sick and they didn't have, like one had a sister who got cancer and she couldn't be there for her, Sometimes maybe it was a death in the family, you know, but then it was also other things. Maybe something unethical happened at work and they just couldn't stand for it. It could be an identity crisis. There was one woman I researched who, you know, she had a child and she was so stressed one morning. And this, you know, and kids sometimes, you know, they lie down on the floor and say, I don't want to put my snowsuit on. So this child had said something like that and she caught herself almost hitting him. And it was, for her, that was a huge shock because she was very against anything like that and she would never have hit anybody and she almost hit her child. So that was her eye-opener. She realized that it's not worth it. I can't do it. So it was a variety of things, but the common denominator was of course that it was so extreme that it gave them the, you know, the sort of, they realized that I just it's not worth it. I can't. Something has got to give. I need to make a change. And sometimes the change was fast. Sometimes they, you know, walked in and quit, but most often it wasn't. You know, it was often a drawn-out experience, you know, especially the women. Women tend to stick around and make sure that the transition is smooth for the employer, you know, help find a replacement and, you know, but it was something that made them realize that I have to make a change, yeah. Yeah.
You mentioned how different it was in the United States to interview or get people to interview, men to interview. And I was curious to know how was your experience when you interviewed men based on your own gender? Was there a sense of them holding back their stories because of the way they relate to you?
That's a really good question. I was worried about that, actually. I was actually, you know, because I started with women, I also, you know, when I started my PhD, I also became a gender scholar because I became very sort of well-read in issues of gender. And one of the things when you study gender is, especially for women's studies, is that if you're in a privileged position, it's hard to study a person who is less privileged because you don't see your own privileges. They're often blind to you. So for men to study women, it can be problematic because men have privileges that women don't have, and so they're blind to them, so it's hard for them to put themselves in that position. So I was very aware of that, and I was thinking, gosh, can I now go out and study men? I'm a woman, you know. And also, when I interviewed women, I had also, they didn't know me, you know, but they knew that I was someone who had opted out and I was now studying it. And so they felt a lot of sort of kinship with me and they were like, you know what I mean. And just because I was a woman and someone who had opted out and maybe, you know, for some also a mother. And I was like, oh, how is it going to be with these men? Is it going to be hard for them to talk to me? And is it right for me as a woman to research men opting out? I mean, I had already become an expert on opting out, but I certainly wasn't an expert on men. I mean, I knew men. I had men in my life, you know, a father, a husband, a son, friends, colleagues. But somehow it's interesting because for men and women in society, we're a little bit, you know, I mean, I don't want to sound, you know, stereotypical here, but, you know, we're a bit sort of, we don't know about what it is about, like, what the other gender's reality is like. So this whole world of men was very new to me, and looking at it in that way was very new to me, you know, and I read everything I could get my hands on about men, you know, in every genre, so, you know, research and fiction and movies and everything. But then at the interviews, I realized that it was actually not a problem at all. And then when I also acquainted myself with researching men, there is actually research that has been done on women researching men. And research has shown, and I can't say this for sure from my experience since I am a woman and not a man, but research has shown that for men it's easier to speak openly to women than it is to men. So it is easier if the interviewer is actually a woman because, and correct me if I'm wrong, you men. But with the woman researcher, there isn't the same need to uphold some kind of a male masculine jargon, which men would maybe do with each other, and they don't with women. So apparently, if we're to believe the research, me being a woman perhaps worked in my favor. And also, the method I used, it's a narrative method where the person who's being interviewed is basically a storyteller, tells his or her story, and I'm just the listener. So, you know, my job was to sit as quietly as possible and say as little as possible, because the interview, you know, I want the interviewee, the person I'm interviewing, I don't want to put words in their mouths, and I want them to decide what it is they want to tell me and in what order and what it is they feel, you know, is more important. That is as important as what it is they're telling me. So I sat very quietly and just sometimes, you know, had open questions to prompt more storytelling. So yeah, I think it was a very good method, and they were all really, really, really open with their narratives, which was wonderful. Yeah. And amazing stories I've heard. Yeah. Yep. Thank you. Yes. Thank you. And please, let's now have wine and mingle. I thought we were going to mingle a little bit in the beginning. For those of you who have come a little bit later, we had to start right away because it's being streamed live as we speak. And so for the people waiting behind the screens, it would have been a long wait. So the mingling is now. So please help yourselves to wine and to chocolate. And let's mingle. Thank you.